They called him the Ice Duke, a man who had buried his heart in a grave 3 years ago and swore never to let it beat again. Sebastian Vane didn't want a wife. He wanted a broodmare to secure his legacy. And when he set his sights on Adeline Sterling, a woman the high society of London mocked and underestimated, he thought he had purchased a silent, obedient shadow. He was wrong. Dead wrong. In a ballroom filled with the most powerful people in England, Adeline didn't just refuse to bow. She shattered his pride into 1,000 pieces. This is the story of a marriage that started as a war, a scandal that shook the monarchy, and a love that had to burn everything down to survive. You are listening to The Duke's Defiance. Let's begin. London, May 1814. The air in the St. James's Palace ballroom was thick enough to choke on, a suffocating mix of expensive perfume, burning beeswax, and the sour tang of judgment. Adeline Sterling stood near the periphery of the dance floor, her back rigid against a marble pillar. She knew what they were whispering. She could feel their eyes sliding over her skin the color of deep, polished mahogany, and the way they snapped their fans shut when she looked their way. To the ton, Adeline was a curiosity at best, and an intruder at worst. Though her father, Lord Sterling, was a baron, his gambling debts were legendary, and Adeline's mother had been a Jamaican heiress whose fortune was long gone. Adeline was 22, penniless, and possessed a sharp intelligence that terrified most men. She was not the English rose society coveted. She was something else entirely. "Keep your head down, Addie," her father hissed, wiping sweat from his balding forehead. "The Duke is coming. If this goes well, the creditors won't take the house. Just try to look agreeable. For once." Adeline tightened her grip on her fan until the ivory ribs creaked. "I am not a horse to be traded at Tattershall's, father." "You are tonight," he snapped, then instantly fixed a pathetic, wavering smile on his face. The crowd parted. It wasn't a polite shifting of bodies. It was the way the Red Sea might part for a monster. Sebastian Vane, the Duke of Calloway, entered the room. He was a man painted in shades of winter, tall, with shoulders that strained against his midnight blue tailcoat. He moved with a predator's grace. His hair was the color of raven feathers, but it was his eyes that froze people in their tracks, pale, icy grey, devoid of any warmth. 3 years ago, Sebastian had been a different man. But after the mysterious death of his first fiancée and the scandal that followed, he had evicted every ounce of joy from his life. He was ruthless, impossibly wealthy, and in desperate need of an heir to prevent his dissolute cousin from inheriting the title. He didn't look at the debutantes fluttering their eyelashes. He walked straight toward Lord Sterling. Sebastian didn't bow. He simply stopped, towering over Adelana's father. "Sterling," the Duke said. His voice was a deep baritone, smooth as velvet but cold as a tombstone. "I trust the papers are in order." "Your Grace." Yes, absolutely," Lord Sterling stammered, practically bowing to the floor. "Adeline is... she is honored." Sebastian finally turned his gaze to Adeline. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her hips, then her waist, assessing her childbearing potential with the clinical detachment of a farmer buying livestock. "She is thin," Sebastian noted, sounding bored. "But she will do. The dowry is waived, as discussed, in exchange for the settlement of your debts." Adeline felt a fire ignite in her chest. It started low and hot, burning through the shame her father was trying to pile onto her. "I have a requirement, however," Sebastian said, loud enough for the nearby circle of eavesdroppers to hear. "My carriage leaves in 10 minutes. She will come with me now." There will be no long engagement. We marry by special license in the morning. I have no patience for the pageantry of courtship." It was a command, not a request. It was a public declaration that she was so beneath him. She didn't deserve a wedding breakfast, let alone a courtship. Lord Stirling nodded frantically. "Of course, Your Grace. Addie, go with—" "No." The word was soft, but in the sudden silence of the listening crowd, it cracked like a whip. Sebastian froze. He turned his head slowly, his grey eyes narrowing as they finally met hers. For the first time, he actually saw her. He saw the fire in her dark eyes, the proud set of her jaw, and the way she refused to tremble. "I beg your pardon?" Sebastian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Adeline stepped away from the pillar. She smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, the only good dress she owned. "I said no. I am not a parcel to be collected 10 minutes after purchase, Your Grace. I am a daughter of the nobility, and I will be accorded the respect of a proper betrothal, however short." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A woman of her standing, a black woman with a bankrupt father, daring to correct the Duke of Calloway? It was social suicide. Sebastian stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of sandalwood and rain clung to him. "Do you know who I am, Miss Stirling? I could buy this entire building and burn it down for sport. Your father has sold you. You have no voice in this matter." "Then you have made a poor investment," Adeline said, her voice ringing clear and steady, projecting to the stunned court. "Because I am not a possession. If you want a wife, Your Grace, you will treat me as one. If you want a slave, I suggest you look elsewhere. I will not leave with you tonight. I will not marry you tomorrow in the shadows. If you wish to wed me, you will call on me at noon tomorrow, properly, or you can explain to the king why the Duke of Calloway cannot manage a simple engagement." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Sebastian stared at her. His face was a mask of stone, but deep in those icy eyes, something flickered. Shock, rage, or perhaps reluctant fascination. He looked at her father, who was trembling so hard he looked ready to faint. Then he looked back at Adeline. "You are playing a dangerous game, Miss Stirling," Sebastian murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "I am not playing, my lord," she whispered back, tilting her chin up. "I am surviving you." Sebastian held her gaze for a heartbeat longer. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the ballroom. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, with a boom that echoed like a cannon shot. Adeline let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her knees shaking beneath her gown. She had just humiliated the most powerful duke in England. She had saved her pride, but she knew, with terrifying certainty, that she had just started a war. The morning after the ball, the rain battered the windows of the Stirling townhouse in Mayfair. It was a dreary, narrow house that smelled of damp wood and desperation. Adeline sat in the parlour, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. Her father had spent the night alternating between screaming at her and weeping into his brandy. He was convinced the Duke would send bailiffs to drag them to debtor's prison. "He won't come," Lord Stirling moaned from the corner, holding his head. "You ruined it, you foolish girl. We are destitute." The clock on the mantel chimed noon. Bong, bong. On the 12th chime, a thunderous knock shook the front door. Adeline's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood up, smoothing her skirts. The maid, terrified, opened the door. Sebastian Vane stood on the threshold. He was wet from the rain, his greatcoat dripping onto the floorboards. He didn't remove his hat. He simply stared past the maid, his eyes locking onto Adeline across the hall. He held up a gloved hand, signaling his footman. The servant stepped forward, carrying a massive bouquet of white lilies, funeral flowers, Adeline noted with a dry irony, and a small velvet box. Sebastian walked into the parlour, ignoring her father completely. He stopped in front of Adeline. The air around him felt charged, heavy with suppressed anger. "You wanted a courtship," Sebastian said flatly. He tossed the flowers onto the side table with a careless thud. "Flowers. And this." He snapped the velvet box open. Inside sat a ring that made Adeline gasp despite herself. It was a sapphire the size of a robin's egg, surrounded by jagged, sharp diamonds. It was beautiful, but it looked like a weapon. "My grandmother's ring," he said. "Now, we have courted. Get your coat." Adeline stared at the ring, then up at his harsh, unyielding face. He had followed her rules, technically, but he had done it with such malicious compliance that it felt like a slap in the face. "You are mocking me," she stated. "I am fulfilling the terms," Sebastian countered, leaning down, his voice dropping to a growl. "You wanted the public performance? Fine. But know this, Adeline. Once that ring is on your finger, you belong to Calloway. And at Calloway, my word is law. You embarrassed me last night. Do not think I will forget it." "I don't expect you to forget," Adeline said, taking the ring from the box. She didn't wait for him to put it on her. She slid it onto her own finger. It was heavy, cold, and a little loose. "I expect you to learn." She grabbed her pelisse. "I am ready." The wedding, 3 days later, was a grim affair. It was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, but the church was mostly empty. Sebastian had invited no one. The few attendees were curious onlookers who had heard the rumours about the defiant Miss Sterling. When the vicar asked if Sebastian took this woman to be his wife, his "I do" sounded like a sentence passed by a judge. When Adeline spoke her vows, she looked him in the eye, her voice unwavering. She promised to obey, but she crossed her fingers beneath her bouquet. A childish superstition, perhaps, but it made her feel less like she was signing her own death warrant. The carriage ride to his ancestral estate, Blackwood Hall, took 2 days. For 2 days, they sat opposite each other in the confined space of the carriage. Sebastian read correspondence, refusing to speak. Adeline watched the English countryside roll by, the green fields turning into the rugged grey moors of the north. Blackwood Hall lived up to its name. It was a monstrosity of Gothic stone, perched on a cliff overlooking a churning, angry sea. The wind howled around the turrets as the carriage pulled up. "Home," Sebastian said, the first word he had spoken in 6 hours. The staff was lined up in the grand foyer to meet them. They looked tired and anxious. Adeline noticed that the house felt freezing. There were no fires lit in the great hearths. "Mrs. Halloway," Sebastian barked. A severe-looking woman with a ring of keys at her waist stepped forward. "Your Grace, show the Duchess to her quarters, the East Wing." Adeline frowned. "The East Wing? Surely the master suite is in the West Wing." "It is," Sebastian said, removing his gloves. "I sleep in the West Wing. You will sleep in the East. We will dine together once a week to maintain appearances for the servants. Otherwise you are free to do as you please, provided you do not disturb me." He turned to leave. "Sebastian," Adeline called out. He stopped but didn't turn. "We are married," she said, her voice echoing in the cold hall. "You need an heir. How do you propose to get one if we live in separate wings?" Sebastian turned slowly. His expression was one of utter revulsion. "I will do my duty, madam, when I can stomach it. Until then, stay out of my sight." He walked away, his footsteps heavy on the stone floor, leaving his new bride standing alone in a house that felt more like a prison than a home. But Adeline Sterling had not come this far to be ignored. As she watched his retreating figure, she didn't feel fear anymore. She felt a challenge. "Mrs. Halloway," Adeline said, turning to the housekeeper with a bright, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, Your Grace." "Light the fires, all of them. This house is like a tomb, and I have no intention of being buried just yet." That night, Adeline sat in her new bedroom. It was dusty, the velvet drapes smelling of mothballs. She had just dismissed her maid when she noticed something odd. The wardrobe in the corner was slightly ajar. When she went to close it, she saw that the back panel was loose. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open with a letter opener. Behind the wood, tucked into a dark crevice, was a small, leather-bound book. Adeline pulled it out. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was frantic, the ink blotchy, as if written by someone whose hand was shaking uncontrollably. October 12th, 1811. He knows. Sebastian doesn't know, but he does. If I don't leave tonight, I fear I will never leave Blackwood alive. The tea tastes bitter again. God help me. Adeline's blood ran cold. October 1811 was the date Sebastian's first fiancée, Lady Isabel, had died. The official story was that she had fallen from the cliffs in a tragic accident. Adeline looked at the door of her room, suddenly aware of how thick the wood was, and how far she was from anyone who cared about her. She wasn't just in a loveless marriage. She was in a house of secrets. And if this diary was telling the truth, the Ice Duke might not just be cold, he might be a killer. The following morning, Adeline woke to a silence so profound it felt heavy. She pulled the bell pull to summon a maid, but the velvet rope hung limp. No one came. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Adeline threw off the heavy quilts. The fire she had ordered to be kept lit had been extinguished. A pile of grey, cold ash sat in the grate, mocking her. The room was freezing. She dressed herself, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her morning dress, a simple muslin that had seen better days. She didn't bother with the intricate hairpins. She simply tied her dark curls back with a ribbon and marched out of the east wing. If the staff thought they could freeze her out, they had severely underestimated the resilience of a woman who had spent the last 5 years holding her father's crumbling estate together with nothing but wits and sheer will. She found the kitchens in chaos, or rather, a performance of chaos. Servants were bustling about, but nothing seemed to be getting done. Mrs. Blore, the severe housekeeper with the iron-grey bun, was sitting at the head of the large wooden table, sipping tea. She didn't stand when Adeline entered. "Breakfast is over, Your Grace," Mrs. Blore said, without looking up. "The kitchen is closed until luncheon at 2. The scullery maids giggled nervously. Adeline walked over to the table. She placed her hands flat on the wood, leaning in until she filled Mrs. Blore's field of vision. "My husband, the Duke, values efficiency. Does he not?" Adeline asked, her voice deceptively sweet. Mrs. Blore blinked, finally looking at her. "His Grace demands perfection? Then he would be distressed to know that his staff is so incompetent that they cannot keep a fire lit or answer a bell," Adeline said. Her voice dropped an octave, losing the sweetness. "I am the Duchess of Calloway. I am not a guest. I am not a visitor. I am the mistress of this house. If my fire is not lit by the time I return to my room, and if a pot of fresh coffee and toast is not brought to me within 15 minutes, I will not complain to the Duke." She paused, letting the threat hang. "I will simply fire you," Adeline stated calmly. "And given the state of the ledgers I glanced at in the library this morning, ledgers that show an exorbitant amount of money spent on beeswax and wine that never seems to appear in the house, I imagine the local magistrate would be very interested in why a housekeeper is living like a queen while the Duke's home rots." The colour drained from Mrs. Blore's face. The giggling stopped instantly. 15 minutes, Adeline repeated. She turned and walked out. 12 minutes later, a young maid named Tilly appeared in Adeline's room with a tray of hot coffee, eggs, toast, and a roaring fire already crackling in the hearth. Tilly looked terrified, but also looked at Adeline with a strange sort of awe. No one, it seemed, had ever stood up to Mrs. Blore before. But the domestic victory was short-lived. That evening was the mandatory weekly dinner, Adeline dressed in the sapphire silk gown Sebastian had purchased. It was beautiful, but it felt like armor. She descended the grand staircase to find that Sebastian was not alone in the dining hall. A woman sat at the table's right hand. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, draped in black lace and diamonds that looked heavy enough to sink a ship. Her face was a map of sharp lines and bitter judgments. This was Lady Catherine Vane, Sebastian's aunt, the woman who had raised him after his parents died. Sebastian stood by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked tired. When Adeline entered, he didn't smile, but his eyes tracked her movement across the room. "You're late," Lady Catherine snapped, not bothering with a greeting. "I wasn't informed we had guests," Adeline replied smoothly, taking her seat opposite the aunt. The table was long, separating them by yards of polished mahogany. "I am not a guest. I am the matriarch of this family," Catherine spat. She turned her cold, pale eyes on Adeline. "So, this is the one. Sterling's girl. I heard you were exotic. But I didn't realize Sebastian had developed a taste for the colonies." The racism was casual, sharp, and intended to draw blood. Sebastian stiffened. "Aunt Catherine." "What?" Catherine waved a hand dismissively. "We must be realistic, Sebastian. She brings no money, she brings no connections, and judging by her hips, she'll likely struggle to give you a healthy heir. You should have married the Miller girl. Pure bloodlines." Adeline felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she remembered the diary. Bitter tea. He knows. She looked at this woman, this hateful, domineering creature, and wondered if she was the one Isabel had feared. "I may not bring a fortune, Lady Catherine," Adeline said, her voice cutting through the tension, "but I bring something this family seems to lack entirely." "And what is that?" Catherine sneered. "Manners," Adeline said softly. Sebastian choked on his whiskey. He coughed, turning it into a clearing of his throat, but Adeline caught the flash of amusement in his grey eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual icy mask, but it had been there. "Dinner is served," the butler announced, saving the room from explosion. The meal was a torture of silence and scraping silverware. Then came the tea course. Mrs. Blore brought the silver tray herself. She poured a cup for Lady Catherine, a cup for Sebastian, and finally, a cup for Adeline. Adeline watched the liquid swirl in the china. It was a dark, herbal blend. She lifted the cup to her lips. The smell hit her instantly. It was subtle, masked by the scent of peppermint, but underneath lay the acrid, metallic tang of oleander. Bitter tea. Adeline's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at Sebastian. He was drinking his coffee, oblivious. She looked at Lady Catherine. The older woman was watching Adeline with a predator's focus, waiting for her to take a sip. Adeline's hand trembled. If she drank this, she would be sick. Maybe worse. But if she accused them now, she had no proof. "Is something wrong, Duchess?" Catherine asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Is the tea not to your liking? It is a special blend, very soothing. It smells strong," Adeline said. It settles the nerves, Catherine insisted. Drink up. Adeline brought the cup closer. Then, with a deliberate, clumsy jerk of her wrist, she accidentally knocked the cup over. The hot liquid splashed across the white tablecloth and onto the floor. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Adeline exclaimed, standing up quickly. "You foolish girl," Catherine shrieked, standing up. "That was imported linen." Adeline watched the puddle on the floor. A few drops had landed on a discarded piece of meat intended for the dogs. She watched, holding her breath. "I am terribly sorry," Adeline said, backing away. "I feel suddenly unwell. I believe I will retire." "Sit down," Sebastian commanded. His voice was low. "No," Adeline said, meeting his eyes. She saw confusion there, but she couldn't stay. "Good night, my lord. Good night, Lady Catherine." She turned and fled the room, her heart pounding in her ears. As she rushed up the stairs, she didn't look back, but she heard Lady Catherine's voice echoing from the dining hall. "She is weak, Sebastian. Unstable, just like the last one." Adeline reached her room and locked the door. She grabbed the diary from its hiding place and sat by the fire, shivering. They were trying to kill her, or at least make her ill enough to be sent away to an asylum. She wasn't safe, and the man she was married to was either blind to the viper in his parlor, or he was the one feeding it. For 3 days, Adeline did not eat anything prepared in the kitchens unless she saw Sebastian eat it first. She lived on apples she picked from the orchard and bread she bought herself from the village baker during her morning walks. The village of Blackwood was a grim cluster of slate-roofed cottages, but the fresh air cleared her head. The locals watched her with suspicion. They called her the Dark Duchess behind their hands, a nickname that stemmed partly from her complexion and partly from the somber mood that had befallen the estate since her arrival. She needed allies. On the 4th day, Adeline cornered Sebastian in his study. He was buried under a mountain of paperwork, the estate ledgers spread out before him. "We need to talk," she announced, closing the heavy oak door behind her. Sebastian looked up, dark circles under his eyes. "I am busy, Adeline. If this is about the tea incident—" "It is about your money," she interrupted. She walked forward and slapped a small notebook onto his desk. It was her own observations, compiled from the last week of auditing the household expenses she had bullied out of Mrs. Blore. Sebastian looked at the notebook, then at her. He picked it up. As he read, his frown deepened. "What is this?" "That is proof that your Aunt Catherine and Mrs. Blore are siphoning off nearly £300 a year from the estate accounts," Adeline said. "They are listing repairs for cottages that don't exist, purchasing grain for horses we don't have, and ordering wine that never enters the cellar." Sebastian flipped the pages, his expression hardening. "Aunt Catherine manages the household. She has done so since I was a boy." "Then she has been stealing from you since you were a boy," Adeline countered. Sebastian slammed the notebook shut. He stood up, towering over her. "Why do you care? You hate it here. You hate me." "I don't hate you," Adeline said, surprising herself. "I hate how you treat me. But I will not stand by and watch my husband be played for a fool. I am a sterling. We may be poor, and my father may be a gambler, but we know how to count cards. You are being cheated, Sebastian." For a long moment, the silence stretched between them. Sebastian looked at her, searching for deceit. He found none. "I will investigate this," he said finally, his voice losing some of its edge. "Thank you." "I didn't do it for thanks," Adeline said. "I did it because this is my home now, whether you like it or not. And I will not have it stolen out from under me." She turned to leave, but Sebastian spoke again. "Adeline." She stopped. "Be careful," he said. It was the first time he had used her name with anything resembling concern. "Catherine, she is protective of her position. If she feels threatened—" "She is already threatened," Adeline said darkly. "I'm the Duchess. She's just the aunt." Later that afternoon, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. Adeline needed to escape. She ordered a horse from the stables, a spirited mare named Midnight. The stable master, a gruff man named Thomas, saddled the horse with a frown. "Weather's turning, Your Grace. Mist is rolling in off the sea. Don't go near the Devil's Drop." "I'll be careful, Thomas," Adeline promised. She rode hard, letting the wind whip the pins from her hair. The physical exertion felt good, burning off the fear and adrenaline. She rode toward the cliffs, drawn by the wild beauty of the crashing waves below. The mist came in faster than she expected. Within minutes, the world turned into a wall of white. The temperature plummeted. Adeline pulled on the reins to turn Midnight back toward the estate. Snap. The left rein broke in her hand. It didn't just break. It had been cut. Adeline saw the clean slice in the leather, just as the horse panicked. Midnight reared, confused by the sudden lack of tension on one side and the shifting shadows of the mist. Adeline fought to stay in the saddle, gripping the mane, but the horse bolted. They were galloping blind in the fog, straight toward the sound of the ocean. "Whoa, easy!" Adeline screamed. But the horse was terrified. The ground beneath them changed from grass to loose shale. The cliff edge was close. Adeline could hear the roar of the waves hundreds of feet below. She prepared to throw herself from the saddle, knowing the fall would likely break her bones, but might save her from the drop. Suddenly, a dark shape thundered out of the mist. Another horse, a massive black stallion. Sebastian. He didn't shout. He didn't waste breath. He rode alongside her, perilously close to the edge. He reached out, his arm straining, and grabbed Midnight's bridle near the bit. With a roar of effort, Sebastian wrenched the mare's head sideways, forcing the horse to turn away from the precipice. The horses collided, skidding in the mud. Adeline was thrown. She hit the wet heather hard, rolling until she stopped against a rock. Silence fell, save for the heavy breathing of the horses and the distant crash of the sea. "Adeline!" Sebastian was off his horse before it had fully stopped. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her, terrified to touch her in case she was broken. I'm alive," she gasped, sitting up. Her shoulder throbbed, and her dress was ruined, covered in mud and peat. Sebastian grabbed her face in his hands. His gloves were gone. His fingers were warm and shaking violently. "You foolish woman, I told you the cliffs were dangerous." "The rain broke," Adeline shouted back, pushing his hands away. She was trembling, adrenaline crashing into shock. "Someone cut the rein, Sebastian." Sebastian froze. "What? Look at the tack," she cried. "It was cut, just like the tea was poisoned. Someone is trying to kill me." Sebastian stared at her, rain and mist dripping from his hair. The ice in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding horror. He stood up and walked over to Midnight. He examined the broken rein. He traced the clean cut with his thumb. He didn't say a word. He simply bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. "Sebastian?" Adeline asked, her anger turning to confusion. He turned back to her. He looked shattered. "It's not you," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind. "It's me. They aren't trying to kill you because of who you are, Adeline. They are doing it because you are mine." He walked back to her and pulled her up from the ground. For the first time, he held her close. His embrace was desperate, terrified. Isabel didn't fall. Sebastian confessed into her hair, the secret tearing its way out of his throat. She was murdered. And I did nothing. I thought if I married someone I didn't love, someone I didn't care for, the curse would stop. I thought if I treated you like a stranger, you would be safe. He pulled back, looking into her eyes. I was wrong. God help me, I was wrong. I have put you in the center of the web. Adeline stared at him. The ice duke was melting, and underneath was a man consumed by guilt. He hadn't been cold because he hated her. He had been cold to make her a smaller target. "Who is it?" Adeline demanded. "Is it Catherine?" "Catherine is a thief," Sebastian said, his jaw tightening. "But she isn't a killer. She doesn't have the stomach for it." "Then who?" "The man who stands to inherit if I die without a son," Sebastian said. "My cousin Arthur. But Arthur is in London, or so I thought." A crack of thunder shook the sky. "We need to get back," Sebastian said, gripping her arm. "We aren't safe here, not with the mist." "We can't go back to the house," Adeline said. "If the stables are compromised, Thomas might be working for them. Mrs. Blore is against us. We have nowhere to go." Sebastian looked at the dark outline of Blackwood Hall in the distance. "There is one place, the old keeper's cottage in the woods. No one goes there. It's abandoned." He lifted her onto his stallion, mounting behind her. His arms wrapped around her waist, protective and strong. "Hold on," he commanded. As they rode into the darkening woods, leaving the treacherous cliffs behind, Adeline leaned back against his chest. For the first time since she had been sold to this man, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a partner. But as they disappeared into the trees, a figure watched them from the ridge they had just left. The figure lowered a brass spyglass and smiled. It wasn't Thomas, the stable hand. It was a man in a fine velvet coat, his face obscured by the fog, humming a soft, cheerful tune as he turned his horse back toward Blackwood Hall to finish what he had started. The keeper's cottage was a ruin of rotting timber and moss, swallowed by the encroaching forest. The door hung on a single hinge, and the windows were empty eyes staring into the dark. Sebastian kicked the door open, his pistol drawn, a flintlock he had pulled from his saddlebag. He swept the small, singular room. It was empty, save for a rusted stove and a pile of moth-eaten blankets in the corner. "Inside," he ordered, ushering Adeline in before barring the door with a heavy plank of wood found on the floor. The storm outside had turned violent. Rain lashed against the roof like gravel, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Adeline shivered violently, her wet clothes clinging to her skin like ice. Sebastian holstered his weapon and turned to her. In the dim light, he looked wild, his hair plastered to his forehead, his cravat missing, his eyes blazing with an intensity that terrified and thrilled her. "You're freezing," he said roughly. He began stripping off his heavy, sodden coat. "Take this off. You'll catch your death." "And wear what?" Adeline's teeth chattered. "The air? The blankets," he said, grabbing the pile from the corner. He shook them out. Dust motes danced in the gloom. "They are dry, at least." Adeline hesitated, then turned her back to him. Her fingers were numb, useless against the wet buttons of her dress. She struggled, a sob of frustration bubbling up in her throat. "Allow me," Sebastian said. His voice was right at her ear. He didn't wait for permission. His hands, surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline, brushed her neck. He worked the buttons with efficiency, his knuckles grazing her cold skin. With every touch, a shock of heat went through her. When the dress fell to the floor, Adeline clutched the scratchy wool blanket around her makeshift shift. She turned to face him. He had stripped down to his shirt and breeches, his boots muddy. "We need a fire," Adeline said, her voice trembling. "But the chimney might be blocked. If we light it, the smoke might smoke us out, or signal them." "They know we're in the woods," Sebastian said, moving to the stove. "But they won't find this cottage easily in this storm. We risk the fire. I'd rather be shot than watch you freeze to death." He struggled with the tinder, his aristocratic hands fumbling with the flint. "Move," Adeline said gently. She knelt beside him, taking the flint. "You have the hands of a man who signs papers. I have the hands of a woman who has had to keep a draughty house warm with peat and prayer." Within minutes, she had a small, smokeless fire crackling in the belly of the stove. The warmth began to bleed into the room. They sat on the floor, wrapped in the remaining blankets, their shoulders touching. The silence stretched, filled only by the storm. "Why didn't you tell me?" Adeline asked quietly, staring into the fire. "About Isabel?" Sebastian rested his head against the wall, closing his eyes. "Because shame is a heavy coat to wear, Adeline. Isabel was sweet, innocent. Arthur, my cousin, he courted her first, but I was the duke. Her father pushed her toward me." He opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. "Arthur has always wanted what I have, my title, my estates, my wife. He started rumors that she was unfaithful. He drove her to madness with gaslighting, moving things in her room, whispering through the walls. I didn't believe her. I told her she was hysterical." A tear tracked through the dirt on his cheek. "The day she died, she came to me begging for help. She said Arthur was going to kill her. I told her to go back to her room and rest. An hour later, she was at the bottom of the cliffs. I signed her death warrant with my indifference." Adeline reached out and took his hand. It was large, callous, and gripping hers back with a desperation that broke her heart. "You were a fool," Adeline said softly. "But you were not a murderer. There is a difference." Sebastian turned to her. The look in his eyes shifted. The guilt was there, but something else was rising, a raw, undeniable hunger. "You are not like her," he whispered. "You are iron. You are fire. When you defied me in that ballroom, I didn't hate you. I was terrified, because I knew you were strong enough to make me feel again." He leaned in. Adeline didn't pull away. When his lips met hers, it wasn't the polite, chaste kiss of a arranged marriage. It was a collision. It tasted of rain, salt, and danger. Adeline's hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him closer, the fear of the last few days transmuting into passion. For an hour, the storm outside ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the fire and the desperate affirmation of life between two people who had been half dead for years. But the world has a way of intruding. Crack! The sound of a twig snapping outside was louder than a gunshot in the quiet aftermath. Sebastian froze. He pulled away instantly, his hand going to the pistol beside him. He signaled Adeline to be silent. Another sound, the squelch of a boot in mud. Then, the murmur of voices. "Tracks end here. Check the shack." It was a rough voice. Not Arthur. Hired muscle. Sebastian scrambled to his feet, extinguishing the fire with a handful of dirt. The room plunged into darkness. He pressed Adeline into the corner behind the stove. "Stay down," he breathed. "Whatever happens, do not come out." "I am not hiding while you die," she hissed, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth. "Adeline!" Bang! The door exploded inward. Two men burst into the room, lanterns raised, pistols drawn. They were big men, wearing the rough coats of dock workers. Sebastian fired his single shot. The lead man grunted, clutching his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He lunged at Sebastian with a roar, swinging a heavy cudgel. Sebastian ducked, the wood splintering the wall where his head had been. He tackled the man, and they crashed onto the rotting floorboards. The second man saw Adeline. He grinned, a gap-toothed nightmare in the lantern light. Well, now here's the prize. He stepped toward her, holstering his gun to grab her. He expected a screaming noblewoman. He got a feral cat. Adeline swung the iron poker with all her strength. It connected with the man's kneecap with a sickening crunch. He howled, dropping to one leg. Adeline didn't stop. She swung again, this time aiming for the head. The man threw up his arm, blocking the blow, and backhanded her. Adeline flew backward, hitting her head against the stove. Stars burst in her vision. "Bitch!" the man snarled, limping toward her, pulling a knife. Sebastian, struggling with the first man, heard her cry out. A rage unlike anything he had ever felt detonated in his chest. He headbutted his opponent, breaking the man's nose, and scrambled for his dropped pistol. He didn't have time to reload. He used the heavy brass butt of the gun as a hammer. He struck the first man down, then launched himself at the one advancing on Adeline. He hit the man from behind, locking his arm around the attacker's throat. He squeezed. The man thrashed, the knife slicing Sebastian's forearm, but the Duke didn't let go. He held on until the man went limp, dragging him to the floor. Silence returned to the cottage, broken only by ragged breathing. Sebastian crawled over to Adeline. Addie, look at me." She blinked, touching the side of her head. Her hand came away bloody. I hit him." "You did," Sebastian said, ripping a strip from his shirt to bind her head. He looked at the two unconscious men. "They aren't dead, but they will be out for hours." "Arthur sent them," Adeline said, her voice steadying. "Yes," Sebastian said grimly. He looked at the knife wound on his arm. It was deep, bleeding freely. "And he thinks we are trapped here. He thinks we are prey." He stood up, pulling Adeline with him. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. The Ice Duke was back, but this time he wasn't freezing his heart. He was freezing his nerves for battle. "We aren't waiting for morning," Sebastian said. "We are going back to the hall tonight." "In the storm?" "The storm is our cover," Sebastian said. He walked over to the unconscious men and began rifling through their pockets. He found powder and shot. He reloaded his pistol and took the second man's weapon, handing it to Adeline. "Do you know how to use this?" "No," she said. "Point. Pull. Don't miss," he said. "We are going to take back my house, Adeline, and then I am going to kill my cousin." Dawn broke over Blackwood Hall with a sickly, grey light, casting long shadows across the grand dining room. A fire roared in the hearth, mocking the cold storm that had raged the night before. The table was laden with a feast fit for a king: roasted pheasants, warm breads, and crystal decanters of morning wine. Sitting at the head of the table, in the chair reserved for the Duke, was Arthur Vane. He wore one of Sebastian's velvet smoking jackets, looking every inch the usurper. To his right sat Aunt Catherine, pale and trembling, while Mrs. Blore hovered anxiously by the sideboard. "Stop fidgeting, Catherine," Arthur sneered, slicing into a sausage with greedy precision. "It is done. My men reported the tracks went over the Devil's Drop. No one survives that fall. I am the Duke of Calloway now, finally." "It feels hasty," Catherine whispered, gripping her teacup. "We haven't even found the bodies." "The tide took them," Arthur dismissed. "A tragic accident. We will hold a closed casket service next week." He raised his wine glass, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "To the late cold Sebastian. May he rot in—" The heavy double doors exploded open with a crash that shook the chandeliers. Arthur froze. Sebastian Vane stood in the doorway, a vision of vengeance risen from the grave. He was caked in mud, his shirt torn, blood seeping from the knife wound on his arm. Beside him stood Adeline, her hair wild, a bandage around her head, and a heavy horse pistol levelled steadily at Arthur's heart. "I believe," Sebastian rasped, his voice vibrating with lethal calm, "you are sitting in my chair." Mrs. Blore screamed. Arthur scrambled up, knocking his chair over. "Sebastian? But the cliffs." "We took the scenic route," Adeline said, stepping into the room. "Guards!" Arthur shrieked. "Seize them! They are impostors!" 2 footmen stepped forward, but Sebastian roared, "Stand down!" The command was so primal, so authoritative, the servants froze instantly. "Anyone who moves answers to me, and I am in a killing mood." Sebastian walked to the table, picked up a steak knife, and stabbed it deep into the wood, inches from Arthur's hand. "Get out." "You have no proof," Arthur stammered, backing away. "It was an accident." "The men you hired are currently tied up in the woodshed," Adeline lied smoothly, though her eyes were hard as flint. "They were quite talkative." She reached into her bodice and threw the leather-bound diary onto the table. It slid across the mahogany and stopped in front of Aunt Catherine. "Read the entry from October 12th, Adeline commanded. Catherine opened the book, her face draining of blood. "It says, he knows. Arthur knows." "Knows what?" Sebastian demanded. "That she was pregnant," Arthur spat, realizing the charade was over. The mask of the fop dropped, revealing the rot underneath. "Isabel was with child. My child. She came to me for comfort because you were an ice block, Sebastian, but she threatened to expose us. I couldn't let a scandal ruin my inheritance," Sebastian snapped. He vaulted over the table, tackling Arthur to the ground. It wasn't a duel, it was a massacre. Sebastian rained blows down on his cousin, years of repressed grief exploding. "Sebastian, stop!" Adeline screamed, grabbing his shoulder as his hands found Arthur's throat. "Don't kill him! If you kill him, you hang! Don't let him take your life twice!" Sebastian froze, his grip tight on Arthur's windpipe. He looked up at Adeline, seeing the fear in her eyes, not of him, but for him. Slowly he released his grip. "Thomas," Sebastian barked at the stable-master who had rushed in. "Lock him in the wine cellar, then ride for the magistrate." As Arthur was dragged away, weeping and broken, Sebastian turned to Catherine. "Pack your things," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You knew he was tormenting her, and you said nothing. Leave my house. If I see you again, I will not be so merciful." As the room cleared, leaving them alone in the wreckage of the morning, Sebastian collapsed into Adeline's arms. The war for Blackwood was won, but the silence in the room was heavy with the knowledge that the legal battle was only just beginning. The trial of Arthur Vane was the spectacle of the decade, gripping London in a chokehold of gossip. The Old Bailey was packed to the rafters. Arthur's barrister, the vicious Sir Silas Thorne, spent 3 days dismantling Adeline's character, painting her as a manipulative fortune hunter who had turned the Duke against his own blood to secure her position. The jury wavered, their suspicious glares fixed on Adeline, and for a terrifying moment it seemed the ton would protect one of their own. But the defense collapsed when the prosecution called their final, surprise witness, Lord Stirling. Adeline's father took the stand, looking frail but clear-eyed, finally stripped of the haze of alcohol. He didn't just confess to selling access to the late Lady Isabel to settle his debts. He produced the smoking gun. It was a letter from Arthur, written days after Isabel's death, mocking her fragility and bragging about crushing the flower to clear the path to the title. "I sold my honor once," Stirling announced to the stunned courtroom, meeting his daughter's tearful gaze. "But I will not sell my daughter's life." The courtroom erupted. Arthur screamed profanities as the verdict was read. Guilty. The hangman's noose awaited. 6 months later, the shadows over Blackwood Hall had finally lifted. The estate, once a cold tomb, was now filled with warmth, light, and the sound of genuine laughter. Standing on the windswept cliffs where their nightmare had almost ended, Sebastian wrapped his arms around Adeline, resting his chin on her shoulder. The ocean raged below, but they were safe. "I swore I would never let anyone in again," Sebastian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought love was a weakness." "And now?" Adeline asked, turning to face him, her hand resting on his chest. "Now." Sebastian smiled. The ice in his grey eyes melted forever. "I know it is the only fortress that holds." And that brings us to the end of The Duke's Defiance. From a forced marriage to a murder trial, Adeline and Sebastian fought for every inch of their happy ending. If you enjoyed this story, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells me you want more historical dramas like this one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. I want to know, do you think Lord Sterling redeemed himself in the end? Or was it too little, too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.